go Tucker the rebound. And that'll do it. It's over. The Bucks have done it. The long wait has ended. After a half century, the Milwaukee Bucks are NBA champions once again.
You're just trying to figure out what you could have did more. You know, it's tough. Great group of guys, hell of a season. This one gonna hurt for a while.
Chris Paul has already put in a lot of hard work over the 16 seasons that he has been in the NBA. Yet, although his stats are incredible, scoring nearly 20,000 points and passing for more than 10,000 assists thus far, he has been unable to capture the ever-elusive NBA championship.
Back to work, you know, nothing more, nothing less. Ain't no moral victories or whatnot. We sort of saw what it takes to get there, and you know, hopefully we see what it takes to get, you know, past that.
Mic check 1 2 1 2. Chris Paul has always been just about the shortest player on the court. As a freshman in high school, he stood only a little over 5 feet tall. CP3 would grow to 6 feet tall, which would be enough to be a dominant point guard on a national championship under-17 team, where he also earned MVP honors. During his senior year, while coping with the death of his 61-year-old grandfather, who was jumped and murdered tragically by 5 young boys in a park, Chris went out and scored 61 points just for him in a game, averaging 38 points, 5.9 rebounds, 9.5 assists, and 6 steals that senior year, which was good enough for him to be named a McDonald's and Parade All-American. Chris would ultimately decide to stay close to home, attending Wake Forest and quickly becoming a leading point guard on Tobacco Road. He was suspended for 1 game in the ACC tournament after he punched a NC State player in the crotch during the final regular season game of 2005. This incident would reflect his competitive streak, but his leadership and maturity would soon overshadow his temper.
Yep.
That actually could be characterized as a punch.
Yes, it could.
After Wake Forest bowed out early in the NCAA tournament, Chris Paul would declare for the NBA draft and was destined to be a first-round pick. As the 4th overall selection in the 2005 NBA draft by the then New Orleans Hornets, the team played most of their games in Oklahoma City due to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Chris Paul was a hero to the city of New Orleans, someone who they could root for while dealing with the devastation and loss in their ransacked city as a result of Katrina. Paul became only the 2nd rookie in NBA history to lead the league in total steals, and he set rookie records in basically all other categories. For his outstanding first season in the league, he was voted NBA Rookie of the Year. By his 3rd season, Chris Paul and the New Orleans Hornets suddenly had the 2nd best record in the Western Conference. Chris Paul proved that he was a special player even though he was a 6-foot-tall point guard on a court filled with giants. He finished 2nd in MVP voting while making All-NBA and All-Defensive teams. In his first ever playoff game, Chris Paul scored 35 points and in Game 2 posted a Hornets franchise record of 17 assists. New Orleans, with a win in Game 5 of the first round of the playoffs against Dallas, would move on to face the San Antonio Spurs. The Hornets had a 3-2 game lead at one point, and this would become a bit of a theme in Chris Paul's career. Despite being up 3-2, they would stumble and lose to San Antonio in 7 hard-fought games. Chris Paul also didn't really get along with then New Orleans Hornets head coach Byron Scott and announced his feelings rather quickly. As a result, the Hornets obviously decided to side with their franchise cornerstone and fired Byron Scott. Now, Chris Paul would begin to deal with some injury issues during the 2009 to 2010 season and would only play 45 games, which would result in the Hornets failing to make the playoffs, proving that Chris Paul was literally the engine that allowed this team to run. The Hornets were also aggressive in trying to change up the fiber of their team, trading Tyson Chandler for former NBA Rookie of the Year Emeka Okafor. And most importantly of all, Chris Paul would be fully healthy during the 2010 to 2011 season, save for a few games in March due to a scary injury. In a game against the Cleveland Cavaliers, a collision caused him to hit his head hard, leading to a serious concussion, and as a result he was carried off the court on a stretcher. But he would be able to face the Los Angeles Lakers in the first round of the 2011 NBA playoffs, and this is when the world took notice of Chris Paul. With virtually no one to support him and trying to take on the Lakers' Kobe Bryant, who matched a young Chris Paul point for point throughout the entire series, CP3 and company were sent home early. After the lockout of 2011, Chris Paul was dealt to the Los Angeles Lakers in a blockbuster trade which would see him teaming up with the likes of Kobe Bryant. The Lakers were also rumored to be in the market for Dwight Howard, and a super team was definitely in the works to potentially bring Kobe Bryant his final 2 championships so he could finally surpass Michael Jordan. However, in an odd twist of fate, the NBA decided to step in and voided this entire deal, as at the time, the New Orleans Hornets didn't necessarily have an owner, so the NBA took ownership of the New Orleans Hornets, thought this was a horrible deal for the Hornets, and decided to veto it. As a result, Chris Paul was sent to another Los Angeles team that was more notorious for being cursed, but was really beginning to trend upwards. The Los Angeles Clippers would rise fairly quickly though, thanks to Chris Paul's contributions and a young player named Blake Griffin. Thus, the Clippers became a menace on the court. Although this LA team was strong in the regular season, improving to 40 wins and 26 losses, they just couldn't get it done in the postseason. The Clippers took a 3-1 lead against the Memphis Grizzlies in the first round, but Memphis came roaring back, pushing them to 7 games, and in that game 7, Chris Paul would have a team-high 19 points that sealed the win and advanced LA to the conference semifinals. Then the San Antonio Spurs, thanks to Tim Duncan and Tony Parker, quickly swept the Los Angeles Clippers in the second round. In the 2015 NBA playoffs, this might have been the first time that Chris Paul really felt the sting of the roadblock of not making it to the NBA Finals. After defeating the San Antonio Spurs, where Chris Paul put on a masterful performance in Game 7,
Green on Paul. And God, he got it! 1 second left. Clippers by 2.
a hamstring injury would cause him to miss the first 2 games against the Houston Rockets. With him returning, the Clippers then took a 3-1 series lead. With just 1 win needed to make his first appearance in the conference finals, the Los Angeles Clippers would lose their next 3 games. Mistakes were made as both Chris Paul and Blake Griffin tried to not lose as opposed to trying to close the game. Yet Blake Griffin went 0 of 5 and the score moved into Houston's favor. LA was outscored by Houston 40 points to 14 in the 4th quarter. Chris Paul to this day mentions how he has nightmares about that series. But you would think a nucleus of Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, JJ Redick, and of course a championship winning head coach in Doc Rivers would be enough to finally bring the Clippers a championship, right? Well, the next season the Clippers would once again get eliminated in the first round of the NBA playoffs to the Portland Trailblazers after Chris Paul put up over 25 points in Game 1 through 3 and then suffered a broken hand in a Game 4 loss. In 2017, the Clippers would push the Utah Jazz to 7 games, and although CP3 averaged 27 points per game for the first 6 games, in Game 7, Chris Paul was held to 13 points and 9 assists, and the Los Angeles Clippers would get eliminated. This would be one of the biggest what-ifs and biggest tragedies of Chris Paul's career, as on paper you would think that this Los Angeles Clippers team would have been able to get it done. But ultimately, a combination of poor adjustments, really poor situational coaching, and just getting injured at the wrong point resulted in Chris Paul not being able to capitalize during his time with the Los Angeles Clippers. Clippers. In June of 2017, Chris Paul would be traded to the Houston Rockets for Patrick Beverley, Sam Decker, Montrezl Harrell, Darian Hilliard, DeAndre Liggins, Lou Williams, Kyle Wiltshire, a future first-round pick, and cash considerations. The Houston Rockets were running a science experiment with two primary ball-dominant guards teaming up with the offensive mastermind by the name of Mike D'Antoni. Mike D'Antoni would alter his offensive system, allowing Chris Paul to run pick and rolls and sprinkling in James Harden isolations, and defenses just simply didn't have an answer to that. So as a result, the Houston Rockets would finish with a 65-17 record. They seem to be absolutely cruising through the NBA playoffs, crushing the young Minnesota Timberwolves 4-1 in the first round. Then in Game 5 of the second round versus the Utah Jazz, Chris Paul would score a career-high 41 points with 8 3-pointers, 10 assists, and 7 rebounds. Finally, for the first time in his entire career, Chris Paul would reach the conference finals. However, in that Western Conference Finals, he would meet the dynasty of the 2010s, a Golden State Warriors team that was in the process of completely revolutionizing the way basketball was played. And unfortunately, over here we would encounter another one of the great what-ifs of Chris Paul's career, taking a commanding 3-2 series lead by the end of Game 5 versus a Warriors team that just added Kevin Durant. But Chris Paul would injure his hamstring towards the end of Game 5, and as a result, the Golden State Warriors would blow out the Houston Rockets in Game 6 and close the series in Game 7 to knock out the Houston Rockets. In 2019, the Houston Rockets would have the opportunity to rematch the Golden State Warriors, although they were significantly weaker this time. The Rockets will lose in the conference semifinals this time to the Golden State Warriors, although it wasn't nearly as much of a contest. And after rumors of Chris Paul and James Harden not getting along with one another, Chris Paul would get dealt to the Oklahoma City Thunder in 2020 in a trade that would bring Russell Westbrook to the Houston Rockets. Time was running out for Chris Paul, a player who was labeled as damaged goods and a player who Houston Rockets owner Tillman Fertitta said had the worst contract in the NBA as a result of a contract extension that the Houston Rockets signed him to after trading for him. At this point, many assumed that Chris Paul would accept a buyout and potentially latch on with a contending team. But Chris Paul would embrace his role with the Oklahoma City Thunder and would experience a bit of a career renaissance during his age 34 season by averaging 17.6 points per game, 6.7 assists, and a PER of 21.7. Chris Paul was deemed to be a mentor for this young Oklahoma City Thunder team who was good enough to lead them all the way to a playoff appearance, where they would meet none other than, you guessed it, the Houston Rockets. The Oklahoma City Thunder would fight as hard as they could, but they would lose to the Houston Rockets in the first round. However, at this point, Chris Paul successfully rebuilt his reputation. The sad story gets even sadder when you realize that OKC was down only 2 in the final seconds and Danilo Gallinari missed a free throw. Then on the next play, which was the final inbound pass, the Thunder threw the ball away. This past offseason, Chris Paul watched his trade value skyrocket and was traded to the Phoenix Suns. In return, the Thunder would receive Kelly Oubre, Ricky Rubio, Ty Jerome, Jalen Leck, and a 2022 first-round pick in exchange for Chris Paul and Abdel Nader. Chris Paul helped get the ship sailing again for the Suns, averaging 16.4 points and 8.9 assists per game while ending a 10-year playoff drought. Against all odds, they beat an Anthony Davis Los Angeles Lakers team in round 1, swept the Denver Nuggets in round 2, and then advanced to the Western Conference Finals to defeat the Los Angeles Clippers. Chris Paul, at the age of 36, in his 16th season in the NBA, finally had a chance to hoist the Larry O'Brien Trophy, and he was actually favored in this series. But the Milwaukee Bucks, especially a 6'11", 242-pound Greek god named Giannis Antetokounmpo, would stop the courageous Phoenix Suns in just 6 games. In Game 6, Chris Paul did his best to keep Phoenix alive, to force a Game 7 by scoring 26 points, yet he had 2 costly turnovers towards the end of the game. Also, during the loss, he seemed to be hobbling around like he was in his mid-40s, and not so much his mid-30s. Maybe after a short offseason and the long road to the playoffs, it was just that everything finally caught up with him. The shoulder injury, the COVID-19 diagnosis, partially torn ligaments in his shooting hand, and a left wrist issue. Perhaps Chris Paul really is championship cursed. CP3 has played in 137 playoff games with 51 double-doubles, 3 triple-doubles, and in those playoff games has scored more than 20 points 69 times. Yet he becomes the only player in NBA history to lose 4 different series in which his team has held a 2-0 lead. Chris Paul, just like those State Farm commercials, has 2 identities. He's been the both prop piece for all the other players on his team. Then with different teams, he has become the face of the franchise. He was the franchise cornerstone young gun with the New Orleans Hornets, became the veteran saving grace for the OKC Thunder, and this season was sometimes the it man on the Phoenix Suns, depending on which Devin Booker showed up and how dominant DeAndre Ayton was feeling. For other franchises, Chris Paul has sat in the back seat and not complained, and those teams seemed to be the group more destined for a championship, yet they still did not win. With the Los Angeles Clippers, Blake Griffin was the star, and CP3 distributed. The Clippers were contenders but still choked, so now it's even harder to explain why. When Chris Paul slid out of the limelight and passed to a red-hot James Harden in Houston, the Rockets were a true threat to Golden State and the Warriors dynasty. Yet again, that team was also unable to get it done. If he retires, he joins the club of NBA stars without championships like Allen Iverson, Patrick Ewing, Karl Malone, Charles Barkley, Tracy McGrady, and Steve Nash. Or maybe he'll be perceived the same way as John Stockton, someone who was always great, but even though he had absurd talent around him, was never great enough to compete with those best teams, the teams that actually won championships. Chris Paul is determined to come back as he wants to win a championship. The Game 6 loss in the 2021 NBA Finals, especially at his age, was a crushing defeat for Chris Paul. Not just because he again produced on the court and came up empty-handed, but because the taste of ultimate victory was closer than it had ever been. The thing is, if he would decide to retire today, Chris Paul is a sure lock, first ballot Hall of Famer, and he leaves a legacy as one of the all-time greatest point guards, and that doesn't change whether he wins a championship or not.